So this is an awareness test. If you've done this, don't give it away. And if you haven't, so just go to watch and enjoy, and then we're gonna have a conversation. Hopefully this works. Let's see. Can you hear it? Narrate it. So the question is, to watch this, how many passes does the team in white make, is the question. Go. So the answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear? So it's easy to miss something when you're not looking for it. So this is an ad, but we're using it today to talk about awareness. So my question for you, for those of you who didn't see the moonwalking bear, the very bad moonwalking bear, why don't you think you saw the bear? You can just quickly throw that in the chat. I'm hoping that this can be a little bit of a conversation. It's going to be kind of tough with so many of us, but share with us, why don't you think you saw the moonwalking bear? You're watching the ball. We were too busy keeping an eye on the ball. It was blended in. We were focused on a different task. The bear is black. We were focused on the white. We were focused on something else. We were doing the task that was given. We weren't looking for it. We weren't expecting it. The first time I saw this, my concentration was on the white jerseys. Okay, so we were doing what we were told to do, right? We were focused on one thing. We were told to count those, the passes for the white team. Now, how might culture, bias, and this video be related? So this is kind of the bigger question. When we think about bias, when we think about culture, we tend to be focused on one thing, on what our bias is encouraging us to focus on. So with that in mind, and thinking about this video and where we put a lot of our focus and our attention, how do you think that can affect or be connected to culture, culturally responsive teaching practices, our students, and the voices that we listen to? So this is kind of a fun activity, right? Somebody just says we're focusing on one cultural group, and maybe not out of ill will, not intentionally, but it's just part of our bias, right? It's what we've been taught and what we've learned and what we've been used to and gotten used to as we've grown up and here in our society. So this connects all to culturally responsive teaching. I'm just going to pause right here and let you know we're all at home, right? So you may hear children in the background. I've already told them to be quiet, but you know how that is. So I apologize if that happens because I hear stuff happening back there. Okay, so culturally responsive teaching. What is this and how is this all connected? So culturally responsive teaching is not something that we can have, that we're going to achieve, that we're going to suddenly use. It's not going to be this like amazing fix that will just one workshop and we're done. Culturally responsive teaching is really meant to fix the system and for all of us to come together to work towards fixing the system. It's what it is. It's a growth in awareness. We're shifting our mindset, our practice, and heads up, you'll never be perfect at it. We're always going to mess up, but what we're always going to keep doing is keep trying and keep trying to work for our students. So you all remember the slide from our first time together on last Monday, right? I can't keep track of days of the week anymore. Last time I met with all y'all, this was one of our slides on there just to talk about what culturally responsive teaching practices are. I'm not going to go over all of this, but really what I want us to remember is that this is all aiding in the fight against bias and inequity, and that's what we're here for. So we have a couple different types of bias. Right now we're going to talk about quickly, so I'm going to go over all this bias and then we're going to go into the student voice piece and how it's all connected. But I really want to talk about institutional bias and our own bias in just a second. We are all part of this system. We are part of institutional bias, whether we like it or not. That's just what we are a part of as educators within this ginormous system. So institutional bias is a tendency for the procedures. Think about our procedures, think about our practices, and the way that they operate. And what it does is it results in a certain social group being advantaged and others being disadvantaged or devalued. This isn't the result of our conscious prejudice or discrimination, but really what it is the majority simply following our existing rules and norms. And so we are all part of this system. And this is the inherent tendency of a system or process to support particular outcomes. And our work is to really start to break down this institutional bias. Ways that this happens within our institutions is in our instructional materials, our curriculum, sometimes examples that we provide in the classroom, our syllabus, verbal exchanges, even nonverbal exchanges, the way that we look sometimes, our body language, and then the design of our classroom. So we have our institutional bias, and then we have our own implicit bias, what we bring to the table. And this is the attitudes and stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an implicit manner. We don't necessarily even realize this is happening a lot of the times. It's activated involuntarily without awareness or intentional control, and it can be positive or negative. So everyone has bias, but we have to acknowledge it and know that it exists. Implicit bias can work against our consciously stated beliefs, values, and attitudes. We may feel one way, we may express something in one way, and then our biases may come in without us even realizing it, without us even noticing. This can be the way that we treat a certain group, what we assume from certain people, and to different groups and types of people and students and each other and systems. I encourage you all to Google the Harvard Implicit Association Test on Race. It's really interesting. It's this implicit bias test where you go in and you just follow the directions, and it really helps you understand where your biases may lie so that you can adjust those and just be more aware of them and more aware of the way that you're interacting with the world around you. So let's think about bias and what we know about institutional bias and our own implicit bias, and let's think about student voice. How and why is this connected? So student voice, what really it is in education, student voice refers to the values, opinions, beliefs, perspectives, and cultural backgrounds of individual students and groups of students. And this is based on their choices, interests, passions, and ambitions. So thinking about all of our possible bias, whether we like them or not, but knowing that they exist, how, like I asked you in the beginning, how can that affect student voices when we know that this is what student voice is? Student voices are values, opinions, and beliefs. Can our own opinions, values, and beliefs get in the way of the voices of our students sometimes? Can we end up listening to certain voices over others? Can we end up stifling sometimes? Can we end up assuming that maybe certain voices or certain students don't have a voice that can and should be heard? And maybe we wouldn't say that out loud, but it might be something that we do express within our body language or our tone or the way that we structure our classroom. Now, all of this isn't to make us like feel bad, like, oh, we're horrible teachers, we're bad people, and we're biased all the time. What this is doing is allowing us to really think about the way that we engage with our students and their voices. So again, how does our bias or any bias prevent authentic and meaningful student voice? So I just want you all to think about this. If you can, add this to the chat. Just process what we just went over in terms of implicit bias, institutional bias, and how it's connected to our students' voices. So again, how does bias prevent authentic and meaningful student voice? So let's go ahead and throw anything in there in the chat. Give you a minute to process. So students may just tell you what they think that you want to hear. Our instructional materials may stifle students' ability to express their values, opinions, and beliefs. They don't want to be different. Like the video, I might miss things that are right in front of me because our focus, right? We have so many things to focus on. Students may be discouraged from engaging in the class or with the teacher. We frame everything we do around implicit biases unless we intentionally plan around it. We may assume that they have or don't have prior knowledge. Assimilation, oh, I missed that one, is much safer and less received than authentic voice. Authentic voice is learned and practiced over time. Our job is to create safe spaces, or spaces for students to safely do that. Just in working with my own kids, or working just my day-to-day with my own students, or my own children, my own kids here, I see how they watch my face for like, okay, what is it that she really wants to hear? What is it that she really wants? Even though I might be telling her, tell me honestly what you think or feel, they're watching me to change exactly what it is that they're thinking or feeling to go along with what the right answer is, right? By not providing opportunity for open discussions. And a lot of these things, and I heard it in one of the groups, I think it was last week, it was that a lot of this is really letting go of control, and that's scary. And we're going to talk about that a little bit right now too. So thank you all for sharing. I think we're all in a really good space right now. So we're going to think about our bias and the types of student voice. We all have these students in our classrooms and our schools. So right now I want you to think about some students just in your mind as I go through these different types of student voice, and what our goal is to do in our classrooms and our schools is to get to that authentic and meaningful, which is right there in the middle, a balance of all of these. So we have conventional. So think about which students usually use their voices in this way. We have, again, conventional. These voices are shared in spaces usually created by adults with adult developed parameters. Adults know what is going to happen and what the outcomes are going to be. So a lot of times we encourage student voice, tell me your voice, but we know exactly who's going to talk, how they're going to talk, when they're going to talk, what they're sharing, how they're going to share it. So this feels really safe to us. And for a large group of students, or for a certain group of students, this is super safe for them too. They really like these conventional opportunities. My daughter, she's very conventional in this way. She likes these really safe spaces where she can be the good one. We listen to a lot of these students. And then agreeable. What is said is usually very much aligned with adult ideals, or they are adult ideas. and are often by students who are generally expected to share their voice. So we'll often get students up in that agreeable and conventional space, right? So think about who those students are, and do you tend to lean on them a little bit more, or lean on these situations a little bit more? And then we go into the unconventional realm here. How it's shared is often unpredictable and maybe a harsh reality or critique. So this is where we think about student voice in ways that we may not even consider it as voice. This may be tagging in the bathroom. This may be ditching school. This may be fights. This may be argumentative, disruptive behavior. Or this may be something that somebody, a student is saying something that's super agreeable, something that's on point, something that the adults generally agree with, but maybe they're saying it in a very unconventional, kind of startling, wait, I'm not sure if this is okay kind of way. So let's think about who those students are, and are we generally inviting their voices? And then we have the disagreeable. What is shared is not considered acceptable in terms of what is shared and how, and it's often by students who don't adhere to adult expectations. So we have a lot of these students, right? We know these students. Do they have voice? Do they have opinions? Do they have something that they're trying to share? Yes. Are we listening to them? Do we want to listen to them? How are we helping them to be able to move those voices more into that authentic and meaningful realm? So what I want you all to do is to kind of think about these different areas and think about some of your students and maybe an example or an incident or something where, yes, like I know this student, I listen to this student more, or maybe this student who I really, really listen to all the time, or I tend to be more biased to, they kind of like threw me off and they express their voice in like all the wrong ways. Sorry, big noise in the background. So if you have any of these examples, I would love to see them. You can share them with the rest of the group. So we're talking about code switching here. As a dean of students, I really found myself working with these different types of voices and having to work with those students to help them find their voice in a more, again, authentic and meaningful way. What they had to say may have been really, really important, and we needed to hear it. They were telling us their needs, they were expressing what they needed from us, but they were not saying it in ways that we can necessarily hear. Our biases were getting in the way. So I had to get out of my own bias, and I had to try to listen to that student, to really listen to what it was that they were needing and asking for, and help them find a way that may be a little bit more conventional, may be a little bit more agreeable, so that the rest of us can hear them. So thinking about the institutional bias, our own implicit bias, how can student voices disrupt these biases? How can they disrupt them for ourselves and for institutions as a whole? And how can we support that? So that's like the work that we're talking about here. How can we bring in all of these voices to be able to disrupt the bias that we all have within ourselves and that our institutions have as well? So to do that, we have to build some alliances with our students. And then again, this is where we have to release some control. We can tend to lean into this more over-controlling space, whether we want to or not. This is where youth may be forced to participate, where we are making the choices for our students, where we may feel like we have this really amazing like project or activity going on, but there really isn't any sort of choice or voice involved. We are controlling things every step of the way. But then we can sometimes go all the way over to the other end where we become over permissive. This is where we're no longer a part of things. And I think this, and I know actually, this is where a lot of people assume student voice lives, that we're just giving students free reign without any end, and they can just kind of just do whatever they want. And that's not authentic and meaningful student voice, and that's not a student-adult equitable alliance. What we're looking for is something right in the middle. We're looking for appropriate expectations. We're looking for equitable partnerships, and we're looking for equitable accountability. And that feels safe for students. That's where they're most likely to come out and provide their voice and share their voice with us. It doesn't feel safe for a lot of students when they're in that over permissive space, and it doesn't feel safe for them when they're in that over controlling space. I'm sure a lot of you have taken the restorative practices trainings, and you've seen that the squares, right, where it's like 2 or it's with 4. I remember all of them off the top of my head, but really where we want to live in that with space, right? It's safest for everybody and it's safest for our students. But sometimes, and a lot of times, it's really hard for us to get there because we're afraid that we're going to tip the scales all the way over to that over permissive space. So as we're going through this, again, I want us to keep in touch and thinking about our bias, the institutional bias that we're a part of, and what's coming into our projects, how we're bringing some of this balance into our projects by giving them some choices and opportunity for voices, and being a partner within our work. Somebody said right here, and I have a background in special ed. As a teacher who supports students with IEPs, I feel that the students on my caseload are seen as unconventional, disruptive when it comes to communication, right? Many of these students struggle with sharing their voice, and many people may judge the students for their efforts or lack thereof. They assume that they don't care, or they're assuming that they're not putting in the effort. But every time they try to communicate, they kind of get it just a little bit wrong. They're over to one side just a little bit too much, right? And so as a case manager, this reminds me of the work that I did as building student-led IEPs, like really helping them understand their disability, what their accommodations and modifications were, what they needed to be, what their goals were, so that they can communicate that and practice ways to do that in that really authentic way, and be a part of that decision-making process. Students with IEPs are really struggle with their voice the most, and they're the ones that are going to end up using that voice in all of the most unconventional and disagreeable ways, because at least they're getting their voice out in one way or another. So thank you for sharing that one. So how do we find that center balance place, right? To hear our student voice. We need to jump into this cycle of alliances for equity. When I first found this, now again, I came from special ed, right? And I was all about my students and the case manager, and I was a dean of students, and which was a lot of discipline. But I was able to bring in a lot of restorative practices, and I really felt like I was listening to my kids. And then I found this cycle, and I've modified it a little bit. And I realized where I always stopped. I thought I was doing this, and I thought I was doing it right. And I would start over at that listening. I would listen to my students, and I'd be like, yeah, and I'd validate them. I'm like, yes, you are right. You go, you do it, you go for it. But what I never did is I never really gave them the tools, the true tools to really engage their voice. I never really lifted them enough and taught them enough. And then if I did give them those tools, I usually stopped at the action piece. or I never went back and reflected with them. So we often get stuck in these first places where we are listening and we think that this is student voice and we think that we're good, but we're not continuing this cycle. So I'm going to go through each one of these: listening and engaging. So we're providing opportunities and systems for voice at every space and every level. I think a lot of us really, really try hard here and we get here, but then we kind of stop here. So we have to figure out how to push forward, and how do we validate and respond to our students? How do we acknowledge them and recognize the voices through various practices? And so this is where we're responding and telling them what we think, telling them what we feel, truly, truly engaging. And then we have to authorize and empower. So this is where I think I see a lot, the biggest struggle, I'll be honest, because we tell students, go for it. You can do it, you've got it, you go make that change. But they don't know how to do it. We have to remember that we are the resources, we are the tools. We are the ones who have been here for years going through these systems. So we have to tell them and encourage them and show them the resources. We have to teach them how to collaborate, teach them the systems, how to work, how to navigate through this. And so a lot of our students, sometimes they'll get to this place and they'll be like, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do it. And then they'll quit. And then they'll be like, well, I don't even know why you asked me. Why do you keep asking me for my voice? You keep giving us surveys. You keep doing this. You keep doing that. But then, and then what? And so after a while, they stop wanting to share their voices. They get tired. They're done. And maybe we do give them the tools. Maybe we do give them the resources. But then are we building a true allyship? Are we acting with them? Are we following through with those actions and strengthening our alliances? And then once we get there, are we doing it again? Are we reflecting? Are we building upon our systems? Are we, if they've built some sort of system or activity or some sort of like, change-making project, do we find ways to continue it? So this, I'm going to make sure that you all have a copy of this deck so you can take a look at this, because in the next slide here are all of the questions. And I talked a lot about these questions as I went through these, but I would like to give you all a minute to truly just sit here and look at this. I don't want to again, read it all, but think about, and what I would like to see in the chat, and I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to do this, where do you end up finding yourself stalling or stopping when you're doing the student voice piece? And here are some questions for you to look at your work and to reflect. I hope you all can see it. So do you stop at listening, engaging, validating and responding, authorizing and empowering, ally and act, reflect and sustain? So I'm going to put myself on mute and let you think about that for just about a minute or so. So this may be a little bit of a harsh reality. And I think, again, when I started this and I see somebody here saying this, like, I thought I was doing well into authorize and empower, but reading the questions, I need to work on listening and engaging and validating and responding. And this is true. Like we think that we're in those first phases, but then like we realize, who are we listening to? And again, like, do we have regular systems and procedures and routines in place just to start that engagement process? And then I see somebody here, it's a tough juggling act when you have tougher classes. Yes, because those students are the ones that are using their voices and what we think are all the wrong ways, and they are the wrong ways. But why? Like, why did they get to this space, right? Why are in this, why are they trying so hard to be heard? And where any sort of response is a good response to them and their minds. They just want a response. They just want some sort of validation. So how do we change our systems and our procedures so that those students, those tough ones, have an opportunity for their voice in a more authentic and meaningful way? So we see somebody here, I get stuck on whether or not I'm able to give the appropriate tools and resources to fully empower my students. We want to empower them, but sometimes we just don't exactly know where or how, what to do, right? And that's when we need to reach out to our community, to each other, to outside resources, to community agencies, to other departments, to find what those resources are, because we're not going to have all the answers. So Canvas discussions is where a lot of students were able to bring their voice. And I also see that voice often takes a lot of time. Yes, it does. And so how do we front load that? How do we, again, set in, and I will always go back to this. I learned all about those procedures and routines and systems as a fresh baby teacher when I was an aide. I had a teacher that showed me just how much to front load all of those systems in the beginning, and things ended up taking way less time down the road. So what procedures and systems can we build in our classrooms to be able to allow for that voice, to make it a regular routine, so it isn't taking up all of the space, but it's built into the structures of our classrooms? So yes, we often get stuck at the validating and responding, and we're not moving forward past that, because it gets harder. So again, you're going to have a copy of all of this to be able to look at your projects and see where maybe as a team you're all getting caught up, and where we are tripping over ourselves, and where we can support each other to be able to move forward into this cycle. Because the more students have really that voice, the more engaged that they'll be, and the more invested they'll be in their projects. So I'm also going to give you this, it's basically a continuum of voice, agency, and partnerships. Because really, voice is one thing. Our students have a voice, right? But then we want them to build agency, build that ownership, and then we want to get to that level of partnership, building and co-constructing and co-working and co-teaching in certain ways with our students. So here I have, again, I'm going to give this to you all in a PDF, but here it is right now. And then I'm going to go through each one of these voice, agency, and partnership. And then while I'm going through this, think about your projects. Think about where can you push things along a little bit more in terms of voice, agency, and partnerships. And that's where like choice really comes in. So student voice, what is that really? Where is this where students share their views, opinions, cultures, and needs, which then advises and informs adult practice and action. So really for student voice to actually be voiced, it's not just listening to them and being like, cool, we are actually changing our practices. We're letting that voice advise what we're doing, and we're changing things according to what it is that we're getting. So voice can be done in a number of ways, and these are just some examples. So formal and informal feedback to lessons, units, routines, etc. So that can be just like a quick little survey. This is like a checkout ticket. Just getting that regular feedback. And then the thing is, the trick is, look, thinking about that cycle, we actually do something about it. We actually engage, validate, change things, go through the entire cycle when we get that voice. Regular and consistent student inventories. I think a lot of us do inventories at the beginning of the year. We want to learn about our students. A lot of those times, those inventories end up in a folder somewhere, and we never see them, use them, think about them ever again. So how can we use those inventories to really, truly change our practice, to encourage us to modify what we're doing to meet our students' needs? And then our students are ever changing, just like we're ever changing. How do we check in with them again later on down the year, later on in the semester, to see where they are, see where they're at, see what we can do to meet their needs? Voice is also opportunities to learn about surface, shallow, and deep cultures. We did not go over these surface, shallow, and deep cultures, but it is in all of our other culturally responsive teaching practices workshops, and it's also in the culturally responsive teaching practices text if you've taken a look at that. But basically, it's learning about our students, who they are, and what's important to them. And then we move into agency. And this is the active and purposeful learning by students, providing space for students to reflect, evaluate, and make decisions about their own learning. So how do we do this? This is where students can learn or set their own learning goals and targets. Student-led conferences and exhibitions is a really big part of agency. Project-based learning, which you're all doing right here. Relevant curriculum that really connects to who they are, their culture. Choice assignments. So choice assignments can be brought into project-based learning. So the outcome can look different depending on what the student's desires are. And student-led conversations and discussions, where students are truly leading the conversations and we're not taking it to that conventional space, but we're letting it become more authentic and meaningful and letting them take control a little bit more. And then we have, here's this participation, but I had changed that to partnerships. This is for student-adult partnerships and collaboration to examine and transform practices, approaches, relationships, and improve outcomes for all. This is when we become true partners with our students. This is not an easy task, of course. So, but this can be where students and teachers negotiate and co-construct classroom systems and structures. So at the beginning of the semester, beginning of the year, when you're getting all of your procedures and routines and systems in place, you guys are building them together. What makes sense for our group? Because what makes sense for this group may not make sense for another group. How can you do that together so that they're truly invested in a part of that classroom and community and learning community? Students and teachers investigating and addressing actual issues. If there's a problem in the classroom, if there's a disruption, if something's going wrong with the project or the assignment, it's not moving along like we're all hoping it would, how do we all come together, teachers and students, to figure out what's really going on, what's the problem, and how can we fix it together? We often go to our colleagues, or even most likely we're on our own and we're trying to figure out how to fix this, and we come up with our own ideas and we come in assuming that it will work and hoping it'll work, and oftentimes it doesn't, and that's when we get super discouraged and we're like, I can't. So how do we work with our students and bring that in together and come together to really find those solutions as a whole group? And then open-ended assignments. So this is beyond the choice assignments. Choice assignments, you tell them, okay, you can have like these 3 choices for your project, for your end result. Open-ended assignment, they get to choose what it'll look like. And again, we're releasing a lot of control, and this can be really hard for some of us, but baby steps, get there little by little. So I realized I just went through all of this really, really fast. So I'm going to go back a little bit right here. And I'm going to ask you all, what are some ways that you are bringing in the voice, agency, or participation into your classrooms or into your project? And I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to think about it because I don't want to rush through it. I saw a lot of really great answers for my last question. So again, I'm going to give you a couple minutes. What are some ways that you're bringing in each of these things into your project? I'm loving seeing these answers. It's so exciting. So I'm seeing somebody says, for voice, we try to meet every couple of weeks to share out what's going on in our lives, the classroom and tasks we're working on. And like somebody said, that takes a lot of time. But really what that does is it builds that learning community, right? And then it takes less time, or there's less like chance for disruption or disagreements, because there's that relationship piece. You built that relationship in that community, so the classroom tends to run a little bit more smoothly, and then we make up for that time down the road. So I'm seeing a lot of choices for how students will present it, or what their final design or their final project will be. Giving choice on deliverables, an authentic audience for exhibitions. So that's super important, right? We want to know who they really want to present to, who's it important for them to present to and show their work off to. So students are listing areas of need in the school and local community that will lead to the focus of their research and creation of their PSA. And so they're doing the community action research piece of things. They're engaging with their community to learn what the actual problems are and what possible solutions can be. Again, real world solutions. So identity, we're seeing some work with identity here. That makes me so happy. Student-led conferences. And that's the tough. Student-led conferences are not an easy task. I've been a part of those on multiple ends, but once students get truly invested, it's amazing to see what they produce at the end of those, and for their parents as well. So students are addressing their own challenges and strengths when it comes to mental health. That's huge. And they're creating their own action plans and sharing their findings with younger students, provide mentorship and facilitate a safe space to connect. So that's like building on all of the pieces. We have voice, we have agency, we have partnerships right there. We have somebody asking, what do student-led conferences look like? I know there's a few of you in there that do those pretty regularly. So we can provide some resources, hopefully, for that. So yes, SLCs are difficult, but very rewarding. I agree. Thank you, Ruben, for putting in that link for SLCs. Ooh, our project puts the students in the role of influencers, so they have the powerful job in changing their community. So, oops, as you all are going through your projects, you're going to be able to take what we've talked about here. Not so much as a conversation as I generally like it to be with Zoom, but I'm loving seeing all of your comments here. I'm also going to give you all this in a PDF, PBL Alliances for Equity Audit. So what this is going to do is going to allow you and your team to take a good look at your project and give it an audit to see if you're bringing in some culturally responsive teaching practices and student voice. So here are just some questions for you to think about. So how are your students' voices being represented in your project? And we can talk about, anywhere. I mean, any type of voices, like, are they participating in the building of it? Are we looking at them culturally? Is there representation in the project? So again, next one, how are your students culturally represented in your project? Which cultures are not represented? What data resources are your students analyzing from the project, and where is it coming from? So I'm seeing some community action research right here. So that's definitely bringing in their own community, bringing in their peers. What opportunities do your students have for feedback? And that can be regular, consistent, ongoing feedback for their own work, your feedback for them even, or just how the project is going forward. And then if they're given those opportunities for feedback, are we going through that cycle and actually modifying, changing, validating, and whatnot to actually listen to that voice? How are students reflecting and evaluating their own learning? How are students making decisions for their own learning? So do they have opportunities to shift what they're doing depending on what they're needing? And how are you co-constructing structures for the project? So this can be coming together as a group with the students. I know you're all building the projects together right now, but also can there be opportunities for change and modification based on what your students are asking for? And then what personal identity work and understanding do you need to do before and alongside your students? So what kind of identity pieces can we bring in? Much like what we did at the beginning of the Institute, how can we bring in more identity with our work? So this is something that you all can take to your teams. This alongside this right here, you'll be able to go through this and figure out and look at what are different ways we can bring in more voice, agency, and partnerships. And then also you'll have access again to the cycle, which I think is really something that is one of the most important pieces here. And how can we follow through with this cycle as much as possible in as many ways as we can.